much of India's wealth is owned by its top 1%, the super rich? The answer will shock you, as will many other statistics that have been unveiled in a brand new inequality report by Oxfam. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. Our focus today is on the annual inequality report released by Oxfam that points to a widening gap between India's rich and India's poor. Ironically, this report is coming to the public domain on a day when the finance minister Nirmala Sitharaman has referenced herself as middle class ahead of the next union budget. More than 40% of India's wealth is controlled by its top 1%. The report argues that a one time wealth tax of just 2% on India's billionaires could feed India's malnourished population. And a 1% tax could actually fund the National Health Mission for a little over a year. Is it time then to levy a wealth tax, or will that be seen as anti growth? That, of course, remains a perennial debate in economics, but nevertheless, these figures need closer examination and much greater debate. To take us through these dramatic figures, we're joined now by Amitabh Behar, who's, of course, the head of Oxfam in India. Thank you very much, Amitabh. It's good to see you. You present this report every year, and it often has startling statistics. But this year really caught me when I thought of 40% or 40.5% to be precise of India's wealth controlled by its 1%. The rise in India's billionaires. Now, some would say the fact that billionaires are increasing is a sign of the success of India's growth story. You would argue otherwise. Why is that?
So thank you, Barkha, for having me on the show. But I would certainly argue that otherwise. And I would actually say that the rise of billionaires is actually a failure of our system. What we're essentially seeing, let me start with another very startling data point. And let me start with the global data point, but I'll move to the Indian one, that in the last 10 years, 50% of all the wealth created globally went only to the top 1%, 50% of that wealth. In the last 2 years post-pandemic, 2/3 of the wealth created went to the top 1%. And in India, the wealth created in the last 10 years, 40% of that has gone to the top 1%. And the bottom 50% have only got 3%. So I think it's time for us to bust this myth that there's going to be some trickle down that's going to happen at some point of time.
Let me interject there. When you say in a way that this is the global pattern, what is unique about India? Is there any sort of finding in India that is at odds or variance with the rest of the world?
So, I would say broadly the trend is we are moving towards a way more unequal society.
Globally.
But in India, globally, yes. But in India, I think what we are seeing is the obscene inequalities, because the levels of poverty we have, the levels of malnutrition we have, the levels of poor health we have. So that's something I feel is unique to India, given that we are home to the largest number of global poor, we are home to the largest number of global malnourished children. So I think that inequality becomes way more starker. And let me also say, what also is unique, and I should not speak for other countries, but what we see in India is that you also see a very pronounced gender dimension, which probably is true across other regions, but also a caste dimension, ethnicity, religion, that also is something that gets reflected over the years.
Okay, we'll get into that granularity in a moment from now. But let me quote to you Standard & Poor's sort of forecast for India, which says that India will be the third largest economy in the world by 2030. These are the numbers that the government would point to when you present your inequality report. They would argue repeatedly in favor of this being an illustration of the growth engine. And the trickle-down impact is something that you're saying is not working, even if you accept that the economy is growing in volume.
Yeah. So, how does it help the 80 crore people who are still surviving on the government subsidies? They are getting food from the government. How does it help if we become the third largest economy? I would actually say that it poses a bigger moral question to all of us. that we are not willing to look at the fundamental question of redistribution, that whatever growth that we are looking at is getting completely accumulated at the top. So therefore, I would say it's a moral question. I would even see it as a constitutional question. It's a political question. Even entities like the International Monetary Fund are saying that these levels of obscene inequality are not sustainable. It leads to complete political breakdown, social unrest. So this is a moment, I think, where we need to really wake up and start confronting this reality. Otherwise, this will lead to a disastrous future.
One of the figures that really leapt out at me was the goods and services tax, the GST. I think you say that more than 60% of the GST collection is coming from the bottom 50%. Can you speak a little bit about this finding?
Yeah. So I think it's important for us to also recognize. Let me just add one more fact to that. That last year, 27% of our total revenues came from GST, and that was the largest chunk compared to the corporate tax, compared to the income tax. And 64% of this GST has come from the bottom 50%. And what is important to highlight is that only 3% of the GST has come from the top 10%. So it's fairly clear that with very meager resources, with very small incomes, people are paying a significant amount of their earnings as part of GST, which is
Yeah.
clearly an indirect tax. Whereas the ones who are better off, the richer ones, obviously have a way lower impact of the GST, and they are paying very little of the GST. And this happens in a year, or maybe just say 2 years after we have reduced the corporate tax from 30 to 22%. So that is clearly the story, that we are still looking at strategies, policies which favor the super rich, and the poor continue to suffer.
Now, you are arguing in favor of a wealth tax, put loosely. You're saying 2% one time tax on India's billionaires could actually feed India's malnourished population. You're saying a 1% tax could actually fund the National Health Mission for over a year and a half. People would say to you, these are old socialist ideas. It is the state's job to fund these programs, not the job of private citizens.
Yeah, I agree that it's the state's job, but it's also the state's job to ensure that the super rich are taxed adequately. It is also the state's job that we create a just and equal society. And with the kind of, they're just getting away with almost, I would say, loot of public resources. And in that, if we are talking of a 1%, 2% wealth tax, which is not unusual. And just to say that this is a old socialist ploy, I would not get into a debate and the isms of what socialism is and what capitalism is. However, let me just say that Switzerland has a wealth tax. Spain has a wealth tax. Norway has a wealth tax. There are several Latin American countries this year who are introducing wealth tax. So what we also need to understand, and Barkha, you talked of the socialism. That's why I talked specifically to not divert our attention from the real question that IMF is saying that this is not all right. Let me just also tell you, IMF is negotiating with the Sri Lankan government that they have to introduce a wealth tax after the economic crisis they've gone through. So this is not a socialist entity.
But let me push you back on that. India is
Yeah.
not Sri Lanka. India is not China. We are a democracy where we vote in and vote out governments. There are other statistics, and let me play devil's advocate here. And these are authenticated data about internet use, smartphone use, more than 600 million active internet users. The fact that your sabzi wala today has a mobile phone. The fact that you can pay, you can Paytm or use the UPI system literally from everybody, from the person who comes to sell you vegetables to even buying a flower off the pavement. Many economists would argue that this is all part of the growth story. You're ignoring the fact that there is a kind of growth energy that is enabling all of this. You would say what?
First, Barkha, just to challenge even the numbers that you talked of.
Yeah.
Let's just go back to we did a report a few months ago on the digital divide. And if I remember the numbers correctly, only 15% or 17% children had access to education during pandemic through digital means. So let's be honest about the real access that the poor have in this country. But having said that, I would not in any way say that this is really the growth story, because the point is that you had, by this government's own admission, 80 crore people surviving on the food provided by the government. We saw 2 years ago that it is essentially the NREGA which sustained the population in this country during the tough pandemic period. So while we are talking of the growing economy, we are not addressing the question of redistribution. And I think that's central for any country. As in, I really do not understand, if you have the levels of deprivation and the levels of poverty. And again, let me say that this government has not given us poverty figures for years now. At least till 12-13, we were getting some poverty figures pretty regularly. Whatever we have is ad hoc, but even that is now saying that multidimensional poverty is, say, from 25% to 35%, wherever you put it. And these are startling figures. And we need
Let's,
to answer the question.
yeah,
So
let's talk about tax.
can
Let's
I
talk
just
about tax. Yeah, sure.
I
Complete your point.
just wanted to make that point, as in, what happens to these 30% of Indian population is the question. Why are we so stuck on talking about what happens at the top 1%? Because the trickle down, we have been seeing that. And it's not just these 7-8 years. For the last 30 to 40 years, we've seen this largely the architecture, the neoliberal architecture, which is moving ahead. And we've not been able to see the trickle down happening to the poorest of poor.
Right. Let's talk about tax, though. At the one end of the spectrum, of course, are the poorest of the poor. On the other hand, are the super rich. There is a salaried class in the middle somewhere called the middle class of India. The finance minister today self-identified as a middle class person. Most Indians of a certain sort of educational background or a socioeconomic background will continue to say we are middle class, even though our economic earnings tell otherwise. But the question is somewhat different. When you talk about a wealth tax, do you ignore or overlook the fact that the salaried class, I'm going to call it the salaried class instead of the middle class, the salaried class ends up paying more tax probably than any other class in this country. So when you advocate for a wealth tax, should you simultaneously be advocating for less tax for salaried class people?
So, Barkha, if you see our demands, we're clearly talking of the top 1%. We're
Yeah.
talking of a wealth tax on the super rich. We're talking of inheritance tax. So we are talking of increasing the tax for the top 1%. And therefore, we do understand that there is a large middle class, which is also at the moment suffering. And this story is essentially about that 1% doing its responsibility for the 99% of this country. I think that's really the fundamental question. And I find it fairly odd that people still feel uncomfortable in actually taxing that top 1%, which has seen their wealth increase by almost 3,000 crores on a daily basis over the last 2 years. That's the level of wealth accumulation that we have seen in the last 2 years, and that needs to be taxed. As in, I would say that any sensible government would tax the super rich as well.
What are the global parallels for this? I know Thomas Piketty made was an advocate of wealth tax, but we don't see, please correct me if I'm wrong, inheritance or wealth tax in capitalist-centered economies like the United States. Are there global parallels that you would advocate India could learn from?
Yeah, so I did talk of wealth tax in 3 specific developed countries. Spain, Switzerland, and Norway. At this moment, we are seeing from, let me just say, Costa Rica, Bolivia, Argentina, you might say they're all Latin American countries, but they're all introducing now wealth tax. And this is a serious conversation that's happening. The UN Tax Committee has a subcommittee on wealth and solidarity taxes, and it is making the recommendation of introducing wealth and solidarity taxes. So this is something which is coming up. And as I said, even in IMF, the idea is not about Sri Lanka, but an IMF is using wealth tax as an instrument to raise revenues for eventually public expenditure. So, sorry, go
Yeah.
ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I want to go back to something you said about the 1% being now, in a sense, delivering on their public duty towards the 99%. Again, I ask you, it's a philosophical question. Is that the duty of the 99%? Is it the duty of the state? Because the middle class, the salaried people would argue that we pay very high taxes towards the kind of subsidies and welfare schemes that should have then looked after the bottom at least 10% better than your report suggests that they do. So it comes back to a moral and philosophical question. Is it the duty of the state or is it the duty of the super rich?
So, Barkha, certainly India is a welfare country, and in any, I would say, social contract, it is the duty of the state to ensure those services are provided. However, what we are seeing is clearly that the state needs more resources to deliver those services. And those services would be provided when you have more revenue, and we are just suggesting ways of raising more revenue for the state. So I'm not very clear where is the contradiction. The idea is that the state needs more resources. It needs to tax the people who can easily pay those taxes, and it will only help in the redistributive policies, ensure better health and better education for the population of this country. And let me just say that, again, historically, academically, there's enough evidence which tells us that better infrastructure, social infrastructure, particularly education and health, are one of the best drivers of an equal society. So
let's talk a little bit about the microeconomic welfare schemes that this government centrally has unveiled, whether it's the Jan Dhan Yojana, whether it's toilets for women, whether it's direct cash benefit transfers, whether it's free rations. There are all of these schemes. Are you saying that these schemes have not yielded sort of results in improving the quality of life for people at the bottom of the pyramid?
I think that's what the data is telling us, that these schemes, while they are noteworthy and laudable in many cases, have not been able to ensure a life of dignity for all. And there are some structural changes that are needed. So I would not juxtapose good government schemes with the systemic crisis that we have or the systemic flaws that we have. And therefore, there are systemic questions that need to be asked. One we've already talked about is essentially the idea of relooking at the entire tax architecture. The second is, what are our investments in, say, education and health? And just to give you one simple figure. In India, out of pocket expenditure on health is 60%. And globally, it is just 18%. Why does an Indian need to pay that amount from her or her own pocket?
Is that specific to COVID, where I personally met people who'd sold jewelry, little pieces of land, everything they had basically to pay those hospital bills in private hospitals? Or is this an aggregate even in non-COVID times?
Even in non-COVID times. It's not just during COVID times. And we are still hovering around 1.25% of the GDP in terms of our investment in health. Whereas if you look at even Bhutan and Sri Lanka, they're doing 1.6 and 2.5%. If you go to developed countries, it goes up to 8 to 9%.
I know, but there's smaller countries with 1.4 billion people, right? So is it apples and oranges?
But if you look at even a South Africa, it's significantly higher than India. So the point is that we are looking at systems where there are serious investments being made on education and health. So, and these are drivers of equality. How long can we shy away from actually providing these basic services, which are essentially rights. And what we're actually doing is converting even these services into for-profit privatization. So that's the whole problem. And just coming back to this whole question of the taxes. You're asking me about the taxes. The tax GDP ratio in India still is around 11 to 12%. Whereas in a country like Norway, Sweden, Canada, it goes up to 40%.
Okay. Finally, let me ask you, what is the most alarming data point for you today from your report?
I think, to just put it simply, 21 people who would probably fit in a minibus have more wealth than 70 crore of the Indian population.
21 people. 21 people.
Literally 21 top billionaires.
So you're saying India's top 21 billionaires have more money than 70 crore Indians?
Yes. And I think that's so dramatic. After that, for at least people like you and me, it's not about the technicalities of the report. It's essentially about political action. It's human action that's needed. And it's very, very clear that we are creating an untenable situation. It will lead to huge amount of disruption, political disruption. It will lead to social disruption, and we need to address it. We cannot shift it.
I just want to leave it there with that data point reiterated. India's top 21 billionaires collectively control and own more of the country's wealth than 70 crore Indians. And that is something that we should allow to sink in. These numbers should be widely debated and discussed. I'm not an economist, so I don't know about economic models, but I do know that the data in these findings is dramatic and certainly worth a lot more public and media attention. Thank you, Amitabh, for talking to us, and take care, and thanks for the report.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.